So I'm delighted to have on Dr. Sean McGever. You work with Young Life, you work in ministry, you have multiple PhDs, including, I think, a certificate from the greatest seminary on the planet, Fuller. I think it was in youth ministry, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Wow, you dug deep to find that one. Yeah, I do have
I
a.
did.
I don't have multiple doctorates, but yeah, I did a stint there at Fuller for a certificate in youth ministry.
I had to go digging because I'm like, well, where do you go to seminary? All the most interesting people go to different seminaries. So you've been to the
Yeah,
UK, you've been in the
yeah.
States, so you've gotten the whole experience, but you're also involved in ministry. You work for, or you teach at Grand Canyon University. And so
hmm
you are a theologian, a scholar, a minister, and I'm absolutely excited to have you on here to talk about this fascinating book that I'm sure will be not at all controversial because, it's just a simple book. Book is called, for those who are interested, and I'll put a link, of course, in the description, Ownership, the Evangelical Legacy of Slavery in Edwards, Wesley, and I always said it was Whitfield. I know it's not Whitfield, it's Whitefield, if I'm getting that correct. And so I'm having you here on to talk about all things related to that and to present us with the complexities of evangelicalism as a movement and as a reality. So thank you for being here, and tell us a bit about yourself that I haven't already kind of spilled the beans on. Kind of where do you come from and what have you been up to?
Yeah. And one thing really quick, it is a little funny. It's Whitfield, even though it looks like it's Whitefield. I know. Yeah, it's just
I
one of
was
the
right. Okay.
like my name. My name looks like McGever. It's McGever. It's Whitfield, and we know he actually in like one of his letters just mentioned it in passing to somebody about how to pronounce it. So we have it right from him. But yeah. Yeah, I have another story. When I was in Savannah, Georgia, which part of my book has to do with it, there's a Whitfield street named after him. And then there's a housing area that's right on that street that is spelled with WHIT field, like it drops the E.
Mm.
So even in where he called his home in America in Georgia, they have a street named after him with a different group right there that's spelled different in order to help people pronounce it different. So anyway, but yeah, I live here in Phoenix, Arizona, born and raised, and my wife and three children are here. So they might pop in. I'm not really sure, but didn't grow up in the church. And when I was in high school, some young life leaders reached out to me and got me to go to a volleyball and some pizza and all that good stuff. And I had a good time and, started hearing about Christ and wasn't opposed to it and saw my life changing and started getting involved at a church and got really involved with Young Life while I was still just kind of taking my next steps in life. Went to Arizona State, got a degree in mechanical engineering, did that for a couple of years, worked in business for a couple of years, and then felt called to quit my job. And so my wife and I quit our jobs, and I went on Young Life staff back in 2002 here in Phoenix, and I've been in the same community, in the same Young Life as a ministry, which is out like primarily to high school and junior high kids, kind of adopt campuses as mission field. So I've been the director for that in my community since, well, over 20 years, and at the same high school for over 20 years. I coached basketball there, so I've coached basketball for over 20 years. So was getting text messages from my basketball team right before this. So lots of fun with that. Just really involved in the community. Love what we do here. But then also because I came to faith, as a teenager and they got more involved in ministry, I became curious about the gospel that came to me. And I certainly attested to God working in my life and seeing it change, the power of the gospel to change other people's lives. But I was like, I'm kind of nerdy. I was like, I want to dig into this. I want to understand it better. And I had questions. And so that led me to want to, pursue further education, which I did. And what I started to realize was I definitely attested to the truth of the power of Jesus changing lives. But I also started to recognize that I received a particular version of the gospel and a particular version of Christianity, which was evangelical Christianity, of which I loosely would still own that in a certain very qualified way. But and I recognize that there are certain nuances to evangelicalism that are different from other historical presentations of Christianity and modern ones as well. And so anyway, I became really curious about that. Got an MDiv. It helped me kind of a little bit to learn some ministerial tasks and things like that. But I really wanted to look a little bit more on the academic side, which led me to St. Andrews. And I studied the gospel in the early church and rule of faith and the creed and how that relate. But I was always thinking about through this lens of the gospel that I received and that also the one that I was presenting to young people And that led me to Aberdeen, where I wanted to know more about how evangelicals talked about conversion specifically, and that led me to do my PhD on John Wesley and George Whitefield under Tom Gregser at Aberdeen, and wrote on the theology of conversion. So that's kind of the background, and a little bit of it is just me personally being curious about the type of gospel that I received through all these evangelicals. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Thank you. And so the book, again, not controversial, not charged at all, tackling very simple things that no one has questions about, especially online, if you are so lucky to be online for this sort of question. But what kind of prompted you to look at this question? Obviously, with your background in evangelicalism, I share that. I
Hmm.
call myself neither mainline nor fundamentalist, which basically means I'm not wackadoodle, which, there's lots of us. There are dozens of us. Um, and so it kind of talk a little bit more, if you would, about kind of that evangelical legacy and kind of how the book came to fruition as through these three key evangelical figures, Wesley, Whitefield, and Edwards.
Yeah. Sure. I'll be honest. When I was got my MDiv, somewhere in there they had told me about Whitfield and Edwards. Actually, when I was digging through my old papers, I realized I'd written a research paper on George Whitfield, and don't tell my seminary, but I didn't remember any of it. Yeah, I mean, I could kind of tell you roughly when he was and a little bit, but I didn't know too much. Um, but yeah, so I didn't know when evangelicalism started, but it started in the early 1700s, and it really came on the backbone of people wanting to have an experience of salvation. And really the birth of evangelicalism came through like the Church of England. So we're going to see it birthed the home of it is going to come out of the Holy Club, and then there's going to, at the same time, in the broader First Great Awakening, we're going to see Jonathan Edwards in America. So really, if you look at the history of evangelicalism, there's a whole IVP series. The first book is called like the Age of Whitefield, Edwards, and Wesley. So these are the three people that you need to look at if you kind of want to know where evangelicalism came from, and you're going to dial into like 1730s, 1740s. That is when things really, blossomed and began. It's where the story begins, and you really can't tell the story of evangelicalism without these three people. And so, yeah, just to kind of introduce them really quick, John Wesley is the founder of Methodism. And while there's a lot of stuff going on with modern Methodism, we need to recognize that going back to early Methodism is not just, the United Methodist Church in America, but also how it is developed into, splinter or whatever, but influenced the holiness movement. Also significantly, if the growth of global Pentecostalism, we need to recognize the Wesleyan roots that go back there, even though it might not, there's other things also that factor into modern Pentecostalism. But yeah, the modern influence of Wesley is really massive, and well beyond anything that you might just call Methodist. But yeah, Wesley, Methodism. Jonathan Edwards, if you're a nerdy academic or maybe super reformed or something, you know who he is. But most people, if they've heard about him, it would either because they had to read a sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, in high school, or it would have been because they are under the influence of John Piper.
Yep,
And
that's where I
so,
found out
and
about him.
yeah, and that's
Yep.
how I knew about him as well. And so he has done much to bring to light some exciting things about Edwards, and a lot of other Piper fans have also got excited about him. Whitfield is going to be, oh, great. And of course, there's a maintenance person outside my window doing landscaping somewhere. Anyway, sorry if it gets
You're
loud.
good. I can't hear it. You're good.
Okay, good. Always happens, do this sort of thing. But yeah, Whitfield, a lot of people wouldn't know him, but in his day, he would have been by far the most well-known person. He was the first transatlantic celebrity. He would have been really the first celebrity also in America. He would have been the person in the news the most. But today, a lot of people don't know about him, because he didn't really leave a legacy of anything other than his sermons, which they're good but not great. It was his presentation, his delivery. Apparently, it was just out of this world. I wish I could have been there to hear him preach. But yeah. yeah, he goes back. So these three people, Wesley, Methodism, Edwards, kind of Piper would be thing. One thing about Whitefield is he was one of the favorite preachers and evangelists of Tim Keller. So if you're kind of a real Tim Keller fan and you've read deeply or follow some tweets and things like that he left us, Whitefield is one of his inspirations. So yeah.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. Just to kind of paint the landscape. And one of the key issues of their time and our time, and of course for them, and maybe this is helpful, just kind of bit of grace to them, at least historically, is you can't choose when you're born. You can't choose what sins are going to be around you in the world. I mean,
Right.
Jesus was born into a world of utter darkness and under the shadow of the Roman Empire. He didn't. Well, he chose in some incarnational sense, obviously, being the pre-existent son. But we don't have that sort of luxury, and so you're kind of born into this world, and you just kind of grow up and breathe the oxygen you breathe. And these three men are founders and pillars of evangelicalism, and yet they are breathing the air of the transatlantic slave, the expansion of the British Empire,
Right.
all this sort of stuff. And so, if you could just paint kind of their social world as it relates to slavery,
Yeah.
and as long as you want to take on that, because it's not like they just woke up and founded it. It's they're born into the same
Sure.
world that we're all similar born into. So, if you could speak to that just for a moment, kind of paint
Yeah,
that
yeah,
picture for
absolutely. And kind of connecting a little bit of it before, my interest wasn't in this topic to begin with. My interest is, and my PhD, and it was the first book that I published was on their theology of conversion. But when I looked into it, I recognized some of these historical things. And I remember going to my PhD supervisor asking, like, "Hey, can you tell me more about this?" And when I was doing my PhD, I had to obviously stay super focused on just what I was doing, which was systematic historical theology. Um, yeah, but this book represents some of my lingering curiosities, and also another question of like how is this woven or not woven in with the theology of conversion that I've received? How can I make sense of that with the gospel? Anyway, but yeah, I think one of the things that you want to do is to recognize when they're born. And I can talk maybe in a moment too about the kind of men of our time and other times. That's a very problematic phrase. Remind me about that if I don't get to it. But Wesley and Edwards were born in the same year, like about 100 days apart in 1703. Whitfield is born about a decade later. You can kind of think of them like their little brother or whatever. So what ends up happening is these three men end up providing a really interesting timeline because they're all born around the same time, which also because they all speak English. Whitfield and Edwards are in England. Jonathan Edwards is two generations removed from coming across the Atlantic. Jonathan Edwards' grandparents are from the same areas, in England and all this. And so they provide a fascinating snapshot of what was it that English Christians believed in essentially like the year 1700 as a nice starting point. And then by the time that they die, Edwards dies in 1758, Wesley in 1770, and Wesley goes on to live quite a long life until 1791. So they end up dying at interesting points in the 1700s where there's dramatic changes, not only happening with them, but in the world regarding the transatlantic slave trade and how Christians look at this. But in a nutshell, when they were born, there were no, and I want to say this carefully, people in power who questioned the institution of slavery.
Hmm.
Now, I do want to say it's important for me to say, and it's something that I learned and thought a lot about when I was doing research. I was asked by the director of the African American Cultural Center in Savannah, who was giving me a personal tour alone for a couple hours. It was a great conversation. He asked me this question. He said, Dr. McGever, can you tell me who the first abolitionist was? And by God's grace, I didn't answer because I knew I was there to learn, not to answer a quiz. And after some silence, he said, the first abolitionist was the first enslaved person. I
Hmm.
was like, okay. And that wasn't the answer I was thinking of. And I mean, I think even when we look at the anecdotal evidence about slavery in the Bible, it's not a pleasant thing. It's not a desirable place in society, no matter how you look at it. Um, and so, with that, in 1700, as a snapshot, I say there people in power, there was no voices for let's overthrow the institution of slavery. I think that there probably was, but they weren't given voice, etc. But later, if you fast forward definitely to the end of Wesley's life, 1791, there are Christians in power for the first time saying we need to stop this. We have a rationale why we think this should end, and so because of that, we can look at what was it that these three men were born into, where essentially no people in power questioned it. But by the end of certainly Wesley's life, there are people who are in power who are questioning it for the first time in the really in the history of Christianity, with some very, very minimum, like very, very few exceptions. And so, yeah, they received from English Christianity, and I document it in one of my chapters. I think I have six of them, six categories of beliefs about slavery. One, slavery is ordained by God. Two, slavery is acceptable. Slavery acquisition is acceptable within certain limits. There are certain ways to acquire a person that you would enslave, and there's certain ways you can't. The third one, enslaved people deserve spiritual freedom. There's a little bit of a debate on that, and we can talk about that. Fourth, slavery is a result of sin in the world. This is just a condition, the post-lapsarian condition. Five, slaves must obey their masters, and masters must be temperate. So there's a dynamic in that. And then six, slave conversion or enslaved people conversion does not emancipate them. So if they come to faith, they don't automatically emancipate themselves. They aren't change their place in society, etc. So by and large, and in my book, I try to go through carefully why each of these were held, and a little bit of pushback on some of them. But by and large, these were assumptions that each of these three men were born into, that weren't really questioned by many people, especially people in power. But by the end of Wesley's life, they're all definitely on the table to be questioned or to be rejected. Yeah.
No, and that's very helpful. And so in the sense that the commonality between, say, Wesley, Whitefield, and Edwards is just the oxygen they breathe. I mean, obviously, the oxygen may be a little different in each, but broadly speaking, the world that they're born into is a shared world. So could you? So and from my reading, and of course, you know, you're the expert, so I'll say it and then look at you with a kind of a, am I right? Edwards and Whitefield tended to be less emancipatory than Wesley, and Wesley was only fairly emancipatory towards the end of his life. Is
Right.
that kind of? And so yeah, they're breathing this oxygen, they're going through that. What do you know of any of kind of the causes that maybe? I'll focus on Wesley because I think Wesley is far more interesting. And Edwards, I had Oliver Crisp as a professor at Fuller, so I've had my fill of Edwards for a time.
Okay.
I love him, but can you tell us about Wesley's kind of evolution's not saying Wesley's transformation, because let's
Right.
call it something. Let's think of it more like that. Wesley's transformation on the topic is evolution sounds kind of crass. It doesn't sound biblical to me. But Wesley, okay, so Wesley's kind of transformation on this reality in his world.
Absolutely. Yeah. And because he lived such a long life, I mean, he ends up being the focal point of this book. He is the person on the cover. He lives 88 years. So his life is the one which is the thread in which all the other ones are kind of added to. And he's fortunately the one that sees the light of those three men and changes views. So here's the evolution of Wesley's views. Because he was in the UK and basing his ministry at one of the places that Methodism really grew was in Bristol, which at the time when early Methodism was really growing, it was the number one transatlantic slave port in England. Later, others rose to more prominence, Liverpool and London. But in the early time of Methodism, it was the number one slave port, unfortunately, slave trade port. And so it was around everywhere he was at. There's later in the Armenian magazine and other places, there's people who were ship captains, and other, even John Newton, other people are coming through. This was definitely part of Wesley's life. But what they had there was a barrier to seeing really the reality of what enslaved people's lives were like. What they were used to is the master-servant relationship, and there is a really important distinct terminology that we need to get on board here, which is there's a massive difference biblically, but also just in practice, more common kind of talk about things. There's a difference between a servant and a slave, not just between doulos and such, but like it was common to employ a person, just like how we would employ anyone, to be able to do a task. And almost always that was going to be, if you heard of a servant, that's what they're doing. It was a job that you choose and that you could freely get out of.
So it's
And
maybe more of a class-based distinction versus a
absolutely.
racial. Okay, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, oh, certainly. Though there were some racial
Oh
things,
yeah, of
but
course,
like
yeah.
the
Yeah.
way that we are thinking of them with slavery today, there's a bunch of time and layers that add up to the more complex situation we're in now. But yeah, so when in the household that Wesley grew up in, there were servants that really that's his mother actually kind of directed mostly, but they were just kind of like hired workers. They came and went. In fact, when in the if you have Methodist interest of years, like when he's the fire at their house when Wesley's little, it's actually one of the servants that like alerts them to that. So he grows up with servants, but not, I want to say not enslaved people. These are people who have jobs essentially in the house and live with them. Um, so he's used to that dynamic, and so growing up, he's insulated from kind of the realities of what an enslaved life looks like. Except when he goes to school at the Charterhouse in London, and then when he's in Oxford, he's around a more dynamic environment. Some of it. Well, when he goes to school, he sees more of it, and I document that in my book. He's also running into some literature that he's reading, some plays, Othello by Shakespeare. He's Orinoco, which is you'll read about in my book. He's very aware of the slavery as an idea, and what's happening in the world. But really, when it hits his eyes is when he goes to Georgia, when he goes down there for the colony of Georgia, and he's the first minister there. He's I could get a lot into Georgia, but I'll save it for a moment. When he crosses north and goes into South Carolina, which is where slavery is legal, initially it was illegal in Georgia. When he crosses the line, he for the first time encounters enslaved people, and he's very curious to know about their conditions. And it's not in John Wesley's journal, but in Charles Wesley's journal, there's just terrible atrocities. They're getting accounts of really terrible treatment and the reality of kind of terrible. I think slavery is terrible, but also the really terrible conditions in the American South. So he's aware of that, but then, as you know, he doesn't spend a lot of time in Georgia. He has to get out. He gets out of there quick, and then he goes back to England. And then shortly thereafter, he has his Aldersgate moment, and his ministry and his push for preaching and expanding the Methodist societies is his sole focus. And so what happens is he sees slavery in its worst forms, and then goes back to England, and for 37 years really doesn't comment about it at all. And my book talks about kind of his silence. There's a whole section called Silence. And so there's not a lot there. In fact, I think he's highly complicit with participating in the transatlantic slave trade
So like
through his silence.
a
Yeah,
silent benefactor almost, or passive.
absolutely.
Although
Yeah,
passive is not the right term, but kind of. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
yeah. Now, but this does change when he comes into contact with some of the literature that Quakers are producing. And Anthony Benezet had been writing. He's a Quaker, and he's producing materials. And there's a story that I explained in the book. But Wesley comes into contact, and for whatever, there's various reasons, but it really shakes Wesley. And then in 1774, Wesley writes Thoughts Upon Slavery, where he comes out and largely lifts, as Wesley did, a bunch of the material that Anthony Benezet had already written, which was a common thing then. It's not now, it would call it plagiarism, but that's a whole nother story. But lifts a lot of material out of there, adds some of his own material, and really advocates, say this needs to stop. And that's in 1774. There's this thing that happened called the American Revolution. 2 years later, it actually took the focal point on away from Parliament and other places of what should we do with this institution of slavery? More like what do we do with the chaos in the society? And Wesley diverts his attention actually in an interesting parallel way, but not directly on the topic of slavery. He starts thinking a lot about the idea of liberty. How should Christians think about liberty? So I discussed that, but it's kind of more rather than like it impacting his thoughts about slavery. It kind of he's more focused on what is liberty, what does it mean for our country, and how we should relate to our rulers. And then there's a few other things, but he comes back to it about 7 or 8 years later. And for about the last 10 years of his life, I would say he finally gets into using his platform, using his voice, and having a more mature way to be able to articulate his abolitionist stance. But I will point out that at almost no point does he use the Bible as his rationale for his abolitionism, which is just tragic, and does not set up early Methodism to be able to have a robust and deep well to draw from to be able to encounter the growth of American Methodism, which exploded in the 1800s. Wesley did not equip them thoroughly to be able to face the challenges, which would obviously we know develop into the Civil War.
Right. No, that's very, very helpful. And so he finally gets it, but it's a long silence. What about so and as far as we know, and I'm going to say it, and you can correct me. So I have no problem with that. Edwards breathing the same air, living in the same world. Do we have any evidence that he had a followed Wesley's trajectory, or is his legacy as tragic? I'll use that word, biblically tragic, at least on that front, as the internet basically says that it is. And I'm being crass when I say the internet, but I mean, there is something to be said about where there's fire, there's probably some smoke. Where there's smoke, there's fire.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, Edwards is reformed of a certain sort. Wesley's Arminian. Edwards is a Congregationalist. Wesley's, Church of England / Methodist. But the thing about them that is you could, if you only knew one thing about Wesley and Edwards on this topic, this is the question: what country were they born in? Where did they grow up? That is going to tell the story and answer the question about their view and engagement with slavery more than these other categories. So the fact of the matter, they're born in the same year. Wesley grows up with a master-servant society. Edwards grows up in America, colonial America, with a master-slave society. So the house that Edwards was born into didn't have servants. It had enslaved people who did not have freedom. So he grew up in the institution and practice and management of enslaved people. That was normal for him. And so that makes his upbringing quite different than Wesley's. Not to say, but the rationale is actually very similar, like where they're getting their rationale about how to engage with the institution of servanthood or the institution of slavery is from the same biblical texts. And Edwards grows up in a house with enslaved people. As soon as Edwards has enough money to purchase an enslaved person, he does that. He spends over half of his annual salary, goes to Rhode Island, and he purchases a young woman to be an enslaved house servant, slave. And so his entire life, he enslaves, he and his wife, Sarah. Sarah, his wife, also grew up in a house with an enslaved person, owning an enslaved person. And so this was part of what I just want to say kind of as normal. They grew up with it and they continued it. And I document that in my book. So their experience is quite different. Wesley never had that and didn't see that. And Edwards did. And so, yeah, you're asking, is the story about Edwards as bad as people make it out to be? The facts of him purchasing people, there was a justifying it in a letter that was never published, but that Ken Minkema and Yale found his draft letter on slavery, where he justified the practice on several means. He did say we need to do this with how we manage the institution of slavery. We need to do so with a couple ways, maybe better than others do. But his full throttled approval of the institution of slavery. Certainly was that. When he dies, he wills his enslaved people. He does not emancipate them. He wills them to his family. So that's quite different storyline there.
Well, and that brings up, just because I for those who weren't, I wasn't trying to say because he's a Calvinist ipso facto like I'm not saying you were taking that way. No. I
On this
wasn't saying.
topic. Yeah.
I was just more the person versus their, but I just want to make sure, like, you and I were cool with that. I just want to make sure there's always one person in the comments screaming. I'm like, I'm not making that claim. I wasn't trying to say that, but no, that was helpful. And I think a good way to maybe kind of go from here is kind of the big question that you alluded to, the men of their time, or the people of their time, right? So you've got the world they live in, the economic substructure or the reality of the world, the oxygen, the relationships, the dynamics, the land. All of these things kind of tell a tragic story, a story of sin. But you mentioned men of their time or men of their time. Let's tell me about that, because I can tell I'm like that. That's
Sure.
where it all seems to kind of go. And then I have maybe one more question before I hop off and have to take my son to piano. But tell us about that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, and I didn't know it. I just got like the first copies of the book, but they put that right on the back. I don't know if you can see it. It might be backwards, but they decided to put that front and center at the back of my book, the men of their time. And really, one thing about that phrase, because it's thrown around sometimes to just kind of well, they're just men of their time, as a way to excuse things. And I just want to reject that phrase completely. I think that it's incoherent and actually is kind of self attesting to its incoherence, which would be men of their time. And you actually corrected it in you want to say people of their time. When you hear men of their time, you go, might it be that we're at least missing out on half of society if we say men of their time? That should be our first clue that there's problems with this concept as an explanation for anything. So right away, what about women of their time? Are we hearing their voices? Probably not. So men of their time is already saying a specific group of people, and not all people, but just a specific group. And then of their time, well, what time was that? So when you say men of their time, it's a specific group of people in one time, and to think that like everyone thought like this is just a logical fallacy and a clear indicator, a red flag for weakened thinking. It doesn't mean that we can say, oh, there's a group of people who held a common set of beliefs. Fair enough. Let's talk about why they held those beliefs. But often when that phrase men of their time is used, it's used as a excuse where we should give them a pass. And instead, I think we should hold people accountable and be constructively critical of whatever that group might think, for good or for bad, whatever comes of it. But it usually is used as an explanation to give people a pass on doing something that was wrong. And I think we should really like aggressively challenge that phrase and lean into it. It's the same type of logic, and I don't want to spice things up too much, that say, it's just locker room talk.
Right.
Well, I don't know what locker room you're hanging out with, or what locker room you want to go back and hang out with, like as if that somehow is normal. But that doesn't excuse anything. Maybe that whole locker room should go to jail, or whatever. Anyway, that type of thinking, as if you get enough people to just say, oh, that was just kind of a thing that certain people did, that's not an excuse. It should be constructively engaged and held accountable.
Well, it's like you said, his wife, Edward's wife, same ideology, right. same oxygen, same thing. Right. She, as far as I can tell, is based on what you said, didn't have any hiccups about the whole thing. It's just, it is what it was. And maybe the question,
we have letters where she was pursuing to add additional enslaved people more than her husband.
So it's like I've heard people say that about all sorts of people, and most of the time, you're making an excuse for sin. Last I checked, God doesn't approve of that. So God's not a fan of that. So maybe a final big picture theology pastoral questions. Slavery, of course, is still exists in our world. We have human trafficking. We have economic exploitation. We have it everywhere. Just For some people, it's called student debt. For other people, it's all sorts of things.
For some people, it's being imprisoned and working for $2 a day,
Yep,
things like that. 13th
yep,
Amendment. Yep.
yeah. And it's all around us. And so maybe a word to ministers, to pastors, to theologians, to apologists, to people who care about God's word, care about God's people, God's world. What would be a word you say based on your research and the challenging, tragic, and ultimately, in some sense, redemptive, with at least Wesley's
Hmm. Hmm.
transformation on this issue? What would
Hmm.
be your kind of final word to the body of Christ as we seek to be good people in God's world, to other people who are in God's world that are oppressed by God, by the world? Like what would be your word to them?
Yeah. Yeah. I got like three words, really quick. One is don't worship humans. Like that's a really easy mistake.
Worship one
Um,
of them, only one.
Yeah.
Only
Yeah,
one.
and
He's
that's
not just
actually
human, but
part
yeah.
of the confusion is our Lord Jesus is human and divine. And so we go, oh, we should bow down before a human. Well, there's only one human that we should bow down before in Jesus, and it's Jesus. And so one is be very careful when anyone wants to worship or deify a human other than Christ. So watch out for hero worship, human worship, Christian worship of Christians. The second one is to be aware of power. One of the things, my initial interest is like, what about this gospel that I received? And I still resonate and participate in like a lot of the things that are common to early evangelicalism. I have a passion for evangelism. At the same time, we need to be really careful if we think we hold the power of salvation. As an evangelist, I've been doing this for decades. There's this thing that can get in my head. It's like, if I do this, maybe eternity will change. And if I don't do this, maybe eternity will change for that person. And, that's a really complex thing, just even emotionally or pastorally. There's a lot of things there. But at the end of the day, it can give you a power trip. It's given me a power trip. And so there's a real temptation, I think for all Christians, but in particular for evangelicals, for power to really mess with us. So
Kind of like, who are you to excuse sin? Like, who are you
yeah,
to excuse sin? Yeah,
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 yeah, yeah.
yeah.
And I mean, I don't want to toot my own horn, but that book that evangelism book that's over your shoulder there that you're kind enough to just have there, that was my last book, talks about the emotional response of being an evangelist and the type of power that can mess with you. When things go well, oh wow, I'm really good. And when they go bad, oh, I'm terrible. And so I'm not a very good whatever, evangelist Christian. Anyway, so that part. And then the third one would just be the blindness that we can have. These men, we can't, I have four sections: influence, participation, action, and legacy. None of us have any control over the influences we were born into. Like you said, I can control that I'm a white dude that was born in, 1976 in Phoenix. That here I am. But I was influenced by my culture, my social locatedness, my family, etc. But at a certain point, I decided to participate, kind of like an age of accountability, if you will, with the things that I had been breathing in my whole life, where I go, I know a little bit, and I'm starting to participate. Edwards couldn't control that he was born into a house that enslaved people. But at a certain point, he said, I'm also going to do that. I'm going to go to Rhode Island and purchase Venus. But then third, sometimes once we kind of, I don't know, it resonate somehow. We decide that we want to change. And I in the book I talk about a lot of us. If you think about who we were maybe 20 years ago, we have changed on some things, some maybe major ones, hopefully not too major, but maybe. But all of us have moved our theology in some directions. And if we think, well, if I was going to live another 20 years, if I do, is it possible that I might still be changing? And I'll look back at my current self, I do things differently. So being open to change, and then think about our legacy. My picture is going to be on the walls of my children, most likely. I hope so. And then my if they have children, grandchildren, great children, and they're going to be telling stories about the way I handled me and the influences of what I was like as a Christian living in 2024 in America with everything that's going on. And while I can't predict the future, I'm accountable for, as an adult Christian, to try to navigate the complex world that I live in a way that honors God and honors his word. And so I'm thinking a little bit about our legacy and what we want to be remembered for.
No, that's very helpful. As Jesus said, Go therefore and be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And that is the hardest part of the Bible, in the words of Jesus. Amen.
Yeah, and that's why they're going to say, yeah, Grandpa, we shouldn't be worshiping him because he's a human and he was a man of his time. No, hopefully they don't say that.
Well, no, I appreciate you taking the time. Hey, sweet boy, my son just walked in.
Yeah, that's great.
For folks that want to get to follow you on, plug your socials. Do you have a YouTube channel? If you want to hold the book up for folks so they can at least see it, and I'll put the link in the description.
Yeah, it's a pretty vibrant cover. I do like how it turned out. The IVP folks are really good. So
Love
yeah,
it.
it's pretty
Ownership.
spicy.
Yep, by
Yeah.
Dr. Sean McGever. Yeah. Do you have a socials people can get in contact with you or anything like that?
Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find
Okay.
on Twitter and other places.
All right. Well, like I said, I appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy schedule. You want to say hi? You want to say bye, Nolan?
Bye.
Mwah.
Bye, Nolan.
Thanks, Doc. I appreciate you. Have a good one. And thank you again for the time and for this book. I look forward to reading it in depth and talking with you about it. Maybe at ETS?
Oh.
You go?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Okay.
All right. Take care. God bless.
Alrighty. Bye.